There's a sense in the failures around this case of an overstretched system trying to deal with threats that, it's fair to say, are only going to get worse. Rashad Ali joins me now. He's a senior fellow at the Institute for Strategic Dialogue and a counter-terrorism practitioner who's worked on de-radicalisation programmes and advised the government. Rashad, thank you for being here.
Thank you for inviting me on.
It's Wednesday afternoon as we speak, and besides the public inquiry, the government has announced a wave of measures to try and stop attacks like this. They include a crackdown on knife sales and pressure on social media firms to remove violent content. But let me start by asking you this. We now know that Prevent failed to step in 3 times in this case. Why do you think that was?
When it comes to ensuring that the Prevent strategy is implemented properly, there's probably a number of places where issues can go wrong.
Okay.
And this is usually the human element of decision-making regarding things like how do they perceive someone to be a real threat, or how do they perceive someone to be on the process of being radicalized and we need to intervene and do something about it.
So be more specific. A lot is made of the fact that Axel Rudakubana was acting a lot for you help, right, in the cause of being de-radicalized will be anathema to you, right? I mean, that's exactly what you position yourself against. And yet, as I understand it, de-radicalization can and does work, right? Can you just tell me a bit from your experience about how de-radicalization works in practice?
Absolutely. I think that the truth is the start point of any engagement is negative, because you're starting to talk to somebody as on behalf of the broader society, a society which they've rejected,
right?
A state authority which they see as being part of the problem. And what you have to then do is be able to create a relationship where there's an element of trust, and they know you're on their side. And that comes fundamentally from your focus being the interests of the individual you're talking to. You're there in order to help that individual.
There must be plenty of occasions, though, where they say, I'm not into this. This is exactly what I've set myself against, and I'm out of here.
So this is the reality of this, is that essentially if you're dealing with a voluntary program, then there's going to be times when people may be referred and they don't want to take part,
right?
Which is rare. In almost more than 90% of the time I've engaged with people, they are willing to talk to you, they're willing to engage with you, and they're willing to have that conversation.
You yourself were once an Islamist radical, right?
Yeah, so as a teenager growing up, I was someone that kind of grew up around times when there was a genocide happening in Europe, happening to Bosnians. And it seemed that no government really cared. And so there was lots of reasons to be radicalized as I was growing up, in terms of, as a Muslim, rejected by society.
Yeah.
The radical call of Islamists who wanted a caliphate to expand and spread Islam to all the Muslim world and protect Muslims with this in Palestine, Kashmir, Bosnia. All of those touch points, all of those grievances were very, very strong. And as a simple kid, one state, one nation, one solution to all problems, it's quite attractive.
So when you meet or you hear about someone who's been radicalized, even to the point of committing terrorist acts, is there a part of you that feels a sort of empathy?
In terms of understanding this, we've got to separate between how people feel, why they may feel angry, and why they may be desperate for a radical solution. That is something I think human beings looking at the world today, whether it's looking at what's happening with Ukraine and Russia, where they look at what's happening with Israel, Palestine, and the problems there, I think it's easy to empathize with why people feel there's a need for a radical change in the world today. What we should separate that from is the totalitarian and authoritarian solution and the actions of extreme ideology to bring them about.
The idea that horror and terror is a means to an end, right? I mean, that's it. That's one of the central things you're trying to get out of the way, right?
Sure. So there's 2 things. There's be able to understand how and why somebody is radicalized. And secondly, the connective tissue, the ideology itself. That should be something that we understand, but not empathize and justify. And there are 2 different things there. Empathy with the individual is different to justifying the ideology.
What other structures, schemes, whatever, are in place to stop young people in the future from carrying out what Keir Starmer has called acts of extreme violence perpetrated by loners, misfits, and young men? I ask you that mainly because I think it's fair to say we both know there's going to be more of these cases, because this is about the world we now live in, right? The idea that people in solitude, in their bedrooms, log on, and then off they go. And suddenly they're exposed to and immersed in things that they just weren't that accessible 30 or 40 years ago, right? So what else are the authorities, as you understand it, doing to act on that particular problem specifically?
So I think two maybe contradictory things. First of all, I don't believe that the nature of the major threats that we face in terrorism are solely from loners of that nature. The type of individuals that get caught up within terrorist acts, especially ones radicalized by Islamist ideology and far-right ideology, actually cross the entire spectrum of people, not just loners. There is a very specific group of individuals who, if you like, they don't necessarily embrace Islamist ideology, far-right ideology, or leftist extremism. It's a hodgepodge of different grievances, different political ideologies, and actually those individuals are harder to capture because they're not necessarily radicalized by one ideology. They are on the fringes of violence and radical influences, and so they end up engaging in violent acts which are otherwise not rationalizable in any possible way.
Right.
And that's the challenge, really. And here, the stresses on our system are big issues, whether it's mental health services, whether it's individual support for youth services, whether it's being able to ensure that actually those that fall through the system are captured by our state. And I think those are systemic failures that we are really, really lacking in dealing with. If we are saying we're serious about extremism and radicalization, then yes, we need to be able to say, here are the resources for people that are engaging with this, whether at a community level, whether at the individual level, or whether at the level of mainstream services to deal with this problem. Otherwise, it's just lip service and politics.
That's such a fascinating point, that. And it's such a modern phenomenon, isn't it? The idea that there are people on their own who end up with these very sort of singular combinations of ideologies, right? And maybe fall for the idea of violence for its own sake and so on, in a way that's unique to them. And therefore, they're all the harder to trace and to follow and so on. That's a really, really brilliant point. Right. Do you think the government and the authorities should have been more transparent about their knowledge and their monitoring of Axel Rudakubana? They've come in for a lot of criticism about that point. They should have told the public more.
I think, let's be very clear, we have laws against public reporting of arrests for a very, very good reason. And that reason is to stop prejudicing the judiciary. There's laws that say we should be careful about what we discuss in public in order to not prejudice the case. The people that are saying this know full well what they're calling for is contra legislation in the UK, is damaging against the interests of the people who have, the victims who've had this horrendous crime perpetrated against them, because they want to make sure there is not any reason why this case cannot go to court. The people doing this are not just playing a horrendous game in terms of the politics, but the consequences were providing the disinformation required for the far right to undertake the horrendous acts that we saw.
You're talking about the riots that followed the murders.
The riots, the violence, the attacks on individuals, the racist attacks on black individuals who happened to be there, Muslim communities that were attacked, threats that mosques faced. All of this happened as a result of the mainstreaming of that narrative through politicians that know full well what they're doing is on the verge of breaking the law, if not absolutely breaking the law.
Rashad, thank you so much for joining us.
Sure. Thank you very much, and it's a privilege to be on.